We need to pick up a point that we missed in previous videos, and that is to look at this passage, which is very close to Mill's answer to the objection that the standard of the GHP is too high. And I will look back here. The great majority of good actions are intended not for the benefit of the world, but for that of individuals, so on and so forth. We don't need to worry about everyone, just the people who will be affected. But he puts up an important qualification on this. Except so far as it is necessary to assure himself that in benefiting them, he is not violating the rights, that is, the legitimate and authorized expectations of anyone else. Now, that's actually a revision, an important revision of the GHP. Now, notice that Mill's definition of rights is the legitimate and authorized expectations that someone might have, and he means of the society or of an individual within the society. And Mill's conception of rights is probably not quite as broad as ours. We'll have a chance to talk about that later. But this provision actually adds a little phrase, but a crucial little phrase to the GHP. So if we want Mill's full revised GHP, we have to say an action is right in proportion as it tends to produce the greatest happiness of all concerned, wrong as it tends to produce the opposite. And here's the new part: without violating the rights of anyone. Good. Now, notice the GHP is not just a principle anymore. It has actually become a decision procedure. And let me take you through the 4 steps of this decision procedure. Step 1 is to make ourselves aware of which options are realistically available in a given situation. So often students will come to me for advice about a personal issue. They're often stuck in a dichotomy, a black and white. I either have to do X or I have to do the opposite of X. Often, all I really need to do is to help that person identify a 3rd option and maybe even a 4th or a 5th. This is one reason we need other people, to help us imagine other options when we get ourselves stuck in a false dichotomy. And I call it a false dichotomy because a dichotomy is when we're facing 2 and only 2 options in a situation, but in any really significant ethical situation, there are more than 2 options. Second step, check whether the action violates anyone's rights. If so, you have to rule out the option. You don't need to go any further. If the option does not violate any rights, then you can continue the procedure to step 3. Step 3 is to determine who will be affected by the decision. Some people will be affected, sometimes different people will be affected by different options. Step 4 is to compare the effect of various options on happiness. And remember that we have to look at the effects on everyone who's affected by the decision. Now that's easy for Bentham. He just assigns numbers for the intensity of a pleasure and how long it lasts. Bentham just looks at the quantity. But in the case of Mill, it becomes more complicated. Every option is going to cause some pleasure to someone, but we can't just look at quantity of pleasure for Mill. We also have to look at the quality of pleasures in terms of higher and lower pleasures. And options may produce different pleasures for different people or groups. They may also produce both higher and lower pleasures in some specific combination. And this is never easy to weigh, and it's not completely clear that this decision procedure is going to yield clear results. But in some cases, it does. So take an example that I feel very strongly about, and I know some of you do too: the environment versus the economy. A lot of people, politicians, business people, and so forth, say that we have to balance environmental considerations against economic ones. Balance is good, right? Well, let's consider a specific case, right? Suppose that the US Congress is considering trying to reduce pollution by putting a tax on companies based on how much carbon they produce. It makes it more expensive to produce something. So companies have to charge more, they're less competitive in the global marketplace. But the goal is not to put US companies out of business, it's to move them towards operating in a way that's more environmentally friendly. You have both economic considerations and environmental ones. Again, you will hear that they need to be balanced against one another. But wait, who is affected, actually? The economic benefit is profits. And it's profits for 55 to 60% of the current households in the US who own companies or stocks in companies. That's the current generation. There are some secondary effects on future generations. If the economy is strong now, future generations may get a modestly better start in life and do better overall. That's the economic consequences, which are pleasurable if we let companies pollute as much as they like in order to maximize profit. But who is affected environmentally? Well, all future generations of human beings. And some of us will not survive. Others will be much sicker than they otherwise would be if there were less pollution. So think, for example, of the dramatic rise in asthma cases among children in your lifetime alone. Some people in future generations won't be as smart because pollution causes brain damage and drops in intelligence. There are many bad effects. So how are we going to compare higher and lower pleasures here? In looking at options that promotes profit, there's the pleasure of getting richer, which is indeed fun. You can buy more stuff and more experiences. What's the pleasure of the environmental option? If I cause less pollution today, I won't get a direct benefit out of it. That will happen for future generations. But that is itself a pleasure, something like self-sacrifice, where I get the pleasure of knowing I'm benefiting future generations. And as for Mill, that would always be a higher pleasure than getting rich. The whole idea of a legacy is like this. If you leave something good behind for future generations, you make life better for them somehow, you get the pleasure of knowing that you had a positive impact. And the positive impact lasts far beyond your death. It's almost a kind of immortality. Now you're at an age where very few of you think about this, but you are affected by this. You or your parents may have inherited money that makes your life better today from people who are now dead. Or you may be at LMU on a scholarship that someone established 50 years ago who either had no kids or had more money than they needed to put their own kids through college. Why would they do that? They got the pleasure of giving money for the benefit of future generations. And they got more pleasure, a higher quality of pleasure, out of giving it to LMU for our scholarship fund than they did out of spending it on themselves. At least that was their calculation. I give this as an example, remember, of how we could use the GHP now as a procedure for sorting out and ranking options using those 4 steps I outlined a moment ago. So you can start to think about how you're going to apply Mill to particular cases to do just that. Now here's the place where I repeat something I've been saying every semester for many years about the environment. Some of us want to take care of the environment because we love nature and the planet. We want to show our love for it. I'm convinced that all those warm feelings are completely beside the point. The Earth is going to be fine. It's a naturally balancing ecosystem. whatever we do to the Earth in terms of pollution and other damage, the Earth will eventually recover from and rebalance itself. Don't worry about the Earth. There's only one thing we do need to worry about, and that is that the Earth, in rebalancing itself after the damage that we've done to it, may find it necessary to eliminate us. Since humans are threatening the planet's ecosystem, the best way for the Earth to recover from the damage we've done to it is to get rid of the human species. So it's not about the Earth at all. It's about the survival of the human species. The Earth doesn't need us. We need the Earth in order to survive. And this is why I think it's fairly obscene and nonsensical to talk about balancing economic interests against environmental ones. In damaging the environment in order to improve the economy, we may be violating the rights of future generations to a habitable planet.